3D MJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you are listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Brad Loomis and Alberto Nunez as we talk about what to do with lagging body parts. Whether these be true weaknesses or perceived weaknesses, it can be difficult to navigate through the endless recommendations on how to deal with them. In this episode, we'll talk about what qualifies a body part as lagging, when to address this in your program, and how to manipulate volume in attempts to even out a physique for improved symmetry on stage. So if you have some areas you'd like to bring up, or have some areas that might seem to overpower others, this episode could give you some insight on where to go from here. So I hope you guys enjoy this. Here is how to deal with lagging body parts with Brad Loomis and Alberto Nunez. Why don't we start with our own shitty body parts? How do y'all feel about that?
Yeah.
Okay, go Bert.
Okay. Looking back now, I think it was there the whole time. I remember sitting down, this was baseball practice, and some kid looked at my legs and he was like, why are they crooked? What's wrong with him? And it was my vastus medialis sticking out. And this was pre weight training. It was just a lump on the side of my knee. And he's like, what the fuck's wrong with you, dude? So I've always had medialis and delts, and that's been the way I started essentially. So that should have been a hint, right? But all guys, right away, I was prioritizing probably the wrong things, right? Or maybe not. Because I think when I think of my weak body parts, it's probably going to be arms and calves. Arms and calves. Arms and calves are probably, even though calves don't matter too much. Arms and calves, and then probably just torso thickness. But I think a lot of that's kind of hopeless. That's just because I have such a small, skeletal frame. So, yeah.
Must be nice. Must be nice. And what's funny is you don't have small arms. It's just relative to your giant delts, which we'll talk about later. But relative. Okay. What about you, bro?
I think mine are kind of ongoing and kind of are going to segue into what we're going to talk about later. But I think my longest standing weak body part has been my lats. Okay. And even with the great improvement that I've had in my lats, it still doesn't look like much improvement. And that's basically because I've always had a fairly balanced physique, but it's deceiving because with me, my delts look lagging when you see my entire physique. Mm-hmm. However, if you only see me from here up, my delts actually look pretty darn strong.
Okay.
So it's kind of awkward, because things that look lagging really aren't, just because of the deformed way my V-taper is.
Okay.
But I think, again, regardless, overall theme, lats. Lats have always been my least blessed body part.
Okay, as soon as I talk about my weaknesses, I want you to go ahead and talk about that whole symmetry thing, or what you just kind of alluded to. But me personally, I think it's my whole upper half compared to my lower half. I have the same problem with Brad in that my back's decently wide, but you can't tell because of what he'll talk about in a second. But personally, I feel like my shoulders, everything that makes a great figure athlete, the shoulders and the abs are the exact two things that are the weakest on me. But it's funny because that's the first place I kind of shred up is my shoulder area, but they're actually not big. They just get paper thin way quicker than everything else. But it doesn't matter because they're not big, in my opinion. And then as soon as I start dieting, my butt deflates as well. But anywho, Brad, go ahead and talk about why your lats aren't that small, but they look that small.
Yeah, it's all proportion, and how everything kind of fits together. A lot of times if I'm standing, say, shoulder to shoulder with Bert, we're pretty much the same width, from here to here, from the outside of the delt to the outside of the delt. Mm-hmm. Yet Berto, his shoulders and his lats look so much wider than mine because it tapers down to such a small waist.
Right.
So even though we may measure the same from outside of the delt to outside of the delt, I just look narrower. And so it makes me look like I have, lagging delts. Same thing with lats. I think it's probably fair to say, Bert, you probably are a little bit wider through the lats than me, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of that is honestly structural because your lats are taking the long road to the humerus. Or one is taking the short road, one is taking the long road, which
Yeah,
we'll
true.
explain at some point.
Yeah, that crooked part doesn't help any. But nonetheless, it's not, he's that much wider than me. You know, he's a little bit wider than me, but he looks a lot wider because if both of our lats are this wide, you know, and my waist is, you know, 3/4 of that width and Bert's is half of that width, he's just going to look like he's got a lot, you know, a lot wider structure than I do. So with you, it's kind of like, are your delts, yeah, maybe they are lacking. Maybe your upper body is kind of lacking a little bit, but it's just that when you fit everything together, your bottom half is so good. You know, your legs are so good that it makes your upper body look like it's lagging. And so then, of course, what you got to do? You got to improve your upper body to make it more balanced with your lower body.
And I have and I'm like you, I have a thicker waist. So, yeah. I like to call it SpongeBob, and everyone says no, but I think that's what it's like. I do. It's like when I was in gymnastics, it was a pretty big asset. I was like a little nugget that could go hard and fast, and like I get into figure, and it does me no good at all. But anyways, yeah. So when we say lagging body parts, we don't just mean like if you look at this one little muscle in itself, is it big or small? We mean like, okay, if we're creating a physique for a bodybuilder, proportionately, does it appear bigger or smaller? Which is very different than whether it actually is or not, I think is just the point we're trying to make, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And so I know that people want to, like say a guy who's like, I don't know, late teens, early 20s, wants to start getting into lifting weight. I keep saying guy, but I guess a girl could too, right? Because I was. And you step in the gym and you see all the things that are wrong with you and you want to fix those things, right? But as I think, and correct me if y'all have different philosophies on this, but I would think that maybe the smarter route would be, let's train everything, see what actually blossoms and doesn't, and then you can start specializing, right? And like for listeners who are kind of in that boat, or for listeners who are coaches that have athletes in that boat, how long, like Bert, how long do you think someone should be training before you even begin to do something about these quote unquote weaker body parts?
I think the issue here is that most of us don't start off with a route that's very bodybuilding specific.
Good point. Yeah.
Like I thought I would actually stop training arms when I was in high school sometimes because I didn't want to look like that musclehead doofus. Like that's like I didn't want to look like the guy with like the really tight sleeves. So they'd get big enough and then I'd stop, you know, and I'm like, oh, you know what, we'll train them maybe once every 2 weeks or something like that. Because relative to like what I thought were good arms, I was like, they were okay. And I still think they're okay. It's just that like, honestly, now we're doing something very specific now. Right. Mm-hmm. So like, yeah, when you put everything together, the sport itself is like things that you'd probably be okay with aren't necessarily okay. So again, under specific, the specificity of the sport, I'd say if you have someone who you're fortunate enough to take on rather early, which honestly probably happens a bit more frequently now since younger people are getting started more and more informed. I'd say right at the start of the intermediate phase, to be honest, or somewhere close to the middle of the intermediate phase is where you kind of start to see like, okay, you know, this, you know, my triceps won't grow from, you know, just mostly pressing, going to have to do some direct arm work, you know, that sort of stuff. So I'd say about close to such a long phase, but as you enter your intermediate years would be a good time.
And for the listeners, when do you typically like to use as a marker for the intermediate years?
Ooh, I'd say when you can't progress in an objective manner, which we'll just say is like how strong you are in the gym. I think that's very straightforward. Once you can't do it pretty much weekly anymore, you know, even with like deloads strategically put in there every, you know, 6-8 weeks or so, where you kind of reset things and you try to go linear again. You try that a few times and then it's like, okay, this person's kind of officially cooked. And honestly, that's how a beginner should start. I think when I look back at some of the teenage situations that I've inherited, I'm like, wow, man, I got you up to like a 500-pound deadlift in like 8 months. And like you took this very linear approach, you know, and it was very simple. optimistically lower, amounts of volume, and it's very straightforward. And there'll be some people, I think we discussed this, or it's been discussed in the powerlifting and bodybuilding
the dual athlete
podcast, where someone who's put together for the big lifts typically is going to grow very well head to toe with just a lot of the basic compounds. But for, I'd say, most of us, that's just not going to be the case. At a certain point, your secondary work will have to reflect the body parts you need.
Yeah. Do you feel that same way, Brad, about kind of like, do you have a different system as far as when you like to introduce body part specific volume shifting and things like that we'll talk about later? But to start that, do you immediately see someone that you got that's kind of green and start hammering weaknesses, or do you just kind of take them globally? Here's a physique that can grow, and then once you have reached a point to actually tell, you change things around?
Yeah, and exactly. I think what you just said there at the end is kind of an important part of it, because just to expand on kind of what Alberto said, without prior experience and having been at least relatively lean, a lot of times structurally and kind of the way you put a bodybuilder together, you can't tell what are true weaknesses, even in an intermediate athlete, until they're relatively lean. Maybe not stage lean, uber low body fats, but how many times have we taken what looks like a very muscled athlete, got them lean, and then realize all of a sudden, oh my gosh, you've got bicep attachments that go down to your elbow. You look like you've got no arms, once they're lean. Mm-hmm. It's kind of one of those things where if you're a beginner bodybuilder, even if you are, pretty experienced in the gym, an intermediate lifter, you really don't know how you're going to stack up on the bodybuilding stage until you're at least relatively lean, and can truly see, what your weak body parts are with all of that fluff kind of, shuffled out of the way. Now you take the opposite of that. Say that you take a bodybuilder that has actually gotten lean on the bodybuilding stage, and maybe they have gone through a relatively long improvement season where they have made good improvements. You can reflect back on what were their weaknesses, back when they did get lean on the bodybuilding stage, and say, okay, well, we can probably plan as we get you leaner again, because typically weak body parts, they're kind of always there, you know what I mean? Or at least you can kind of pick up a bit of a deficiency here or there, and then use that information to kind of start planning your body part specialization cycles, or increasing volume on that particular body part, or wherever, whether it be improvement or time for cutting season.
Yeah. And personally, what I found too, which is not as unique as I thought until starting coaching with 3D, is that someone will come to us and they might have been training for a while, but it hasn't been in a well-fed, intelligent manner. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I got a lot of people coming on for their first season last year who would come to me underfed, and maybe it was their first competition season, but they were trying to do it on their own kind of for a few years. And then when we're coming out of season, even though I saw them on stage with, maybe there were some visible weaknesses, we're planning to spend a good 4 months just training everything for the first time in a well-fed state before we specialize body parts, because, we kind of get them in a state where there's no time to grow. And so we're kind of in this whole, like, okay, after your first season, let's kind of restart you from, because they got stronger all throughout season. Do y'all find that that's common too, or is it just me because this was my first full season as a 3D coach? Like, you guys that have had ongoing rosters for years and years, do you get a lot of people who want to compete for the first or second time who have been underfed for a really long time? I know I was this for you, Berto, but... Yeah,
I think ideally a teenager from the start, and then, they run something very starting strength-ish, and we're like, your arms are fantastic, you need very little direct arm work. However, you're going to need a lot of direct delt work and lat work or something like that. Yeah. That's in a perfect world, but that's not how it happens. We usually inherit these situations where a common one for me is definitely that one, where they just haven't fed long enough. Like, they haven't gotten deep enough into that intermediate phase, or they've been slowing down the progress by dieting too much.
Yeah.
The other one is people tend to absolutely love to train the body parts that are standout body parts. And our sponsored athlete, Jessica, a few years back, that was last year, she actually admitted to me that, you know, that's my thing. She's like, I love to train delts because they look freaking awesome when I train them, and I perhaps do a little bit more than I should. And I mean, if you look at her medial like delt, it attaches like more than halfway down her humerus. It's a short humerus.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it grows from picking up dumbbells from the rack, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big one. And then getting into a specialization cycle, I think often is, even for athletes that have these body parts that are just way disproportionately better than everything else, it's hard for them to see that, hey, you know, we need to, you know, focus our energy here because there's only so much recovery to go around. So yeah, we usually don't inherit the best of situations, I feel, or the best of habits, for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would agree. I think another big one is not to sound overly pessimistic, but I think sometimes there's just body parts that, no matter how you look at it, they're always going to be a little behind, and that's just like an attachment thing. My calves will never look like Jeff's for obvious reasons, because mine's attached like right, you know, behind my knee, whereas Jeff's are very low attached. And there's absolutely not, like, calf is probably the most like obvious one, where like it's very belly shape matters, where it attaches matters. And I think that's another big one, along with like, I guess including that in the habits that we inherit, is that having realistic expectations for what you can get from whatever specialization cycle we might run, or whatever approach we might take to bring up those body parts. That there's a limit, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, I want to get into...
Yeah,
I was going to say after... Go ahead, Brad. I'll let you finish.
Well, I was going to expand on what you were talking about, Andrea, with those athletes that are a lot of times underfed. I think athletes that kind of come to a place in bodybuilding, kind of where I came from, where, you know, they are overweight and they are that chronic cutter that's looking for those abs. You know, those are the guys that are coming to us that are chronically underfed, because they've been training in an effort to drop body fat. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, a lot of times, you know, kind of using myself as an example, it was all those years where I was cutting and trying to train and trying to start in bodybuilding, where really I felt like time was wasted because I was underfed. And then, of course, once I did get fed, you know, like you were experiencing with your athlete, well, now all of a sudden my lats are growing, you know, and it wasn't like it was anything special as far as, you know, a specialization cycle, although it helped. It was just that I was training with smarter training in a good fed state, you know. And so a lot of times I think when we do get those athletes that are, you know, training to drop body fat in hopes of getting into the bodybuilding, you know, physique type of a sport, you know, those are the ones that are sometimes limiting their potential for the bodybuilding stage.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when we say well fed, it's not like I know this is kind of like a side tangent, but it's like you're experiencing, Brad, and like I did too. It's maybe you're not actively trying to lose weight, but you're trying to get stronger while maintaining and not getting fat. And I think when we say, and we need to, and like fed means overfed in some cases in order to make the progress that you want, again, globally in the entire physique, much less your weak body parts. So, yeah, I think that's important when someone's like, I'm not always trying to diet, I'm just trying to maintain while I get stronger. And it's like, yeah, but you're not feeding yourself. And that's why you, Bert, come in and out of your mini cuts so much, correct? Is to make yourself gain.
Yeah. And they're very, like, it's always gaining is always
high priority.
The majority of my time is still spent gaining. Yeah. And we try to minimize the time that we spent cleaning up, if you will.
Right. But you got to get a little dirty to need the cleanup, and that's where the gaining happens. Yeah.
Yeah, and Bert and I are very different because Bert can drop overnight, and it's hard for him to gain, whereas I'm the exact opposite. You know, I can gain overnight, and it's a lot harder for me to drop. So usually our ratios, even though they look the same, Bert's are a lot longer gaining phase and shorter cutting phases, whereas mine are longer, more subtle gaining phases and shorter, losing periods.
Okay, cool. So, Bert, will you explain what you mean by a specialization cycle? Can you give me a summary of that? How often you do it, what it means, all that stuff?
Typically what that means is that your high responding body parts, you will drop the total amount of work that you're doing that focuses on those areas. So say you have really, really good quads, you will do a lot less direct quad work. Maybe no isolation work is very common. And then whatever you are doing with your compounds, maybe you cut that down to about a third to half. That's roughly a good place to start with your strong body parts. And then what you do is you bring that over to the body parts that you are trying to focus on. And I think at most, typically the way I like to do it is I like to focus on one body part, maybe two body parts, and drop the volume on maybe one or two gifted body parts. If you're lucky enough to have two body parts that are just like outstanding, that grow almost regardless of what you do. And that's oddly enough what happens is the body parts that respond very well, they're just so sensitive to stimulus that they end up actually growing quite well. And you find out that, oh, wow, like I really only need to do 10 working sets for my triceps a week, and they're absolutely fine. Whereas other body parts, you'll see that they certainly will never grow at the same rate as your gifted body parts, but you will see improvement that you can, once you've been through a few, you're like, I don't think I would have been able to see that had I not, reallocated my resources. Very common place where this happens in a more objective manner, because obviously once you get to the intermediate phase, it's quite difficult to always see progress, especially when you have a nice little coat of off-season body fat, is with powerlifters. Like maybe a powerlifter will get hurt to the point where they can't, a common one is do anything they can't squat or deadlift. So what we end up doing is we become benchaholics for a few weeks, and they go from that infamous poverty bench to seeing improvements in their bench presses that just weren't there before. Mm-hmm. So with powerlifters, often it happens on accident because it's hard for both bodybuilders and powerlifters to kind of reshift their focus and get away from the things that will kind of improve on their own and push it towards just a less symmetrical looking system. But at some point, it's kind of like it's very similar to when you were maybe a 3-sport athlete in high school. It's really hard to excel in all of them. And the same thing kind of like there's specificity within specificity in bodybuilding. And the earlier you can learn that, the better you're going to get the most out of your physique. So yeah, it's basically reallocating resources because, as we know, there's a cap to how much we can recover from.
Yeah. How often would you run a specialization cycle? Not for your, sure, talk about for yourself and then talk about like an average intermediate athlete.
Mm-hmm. So for example, right now, personally, I've been on a kick with like bringing up my back. So I've been doing a lot, like I think it's almost a third of like my total volume goes into like back specific movements, and everything else is just kind of taken over the leftovers. And what I'll typically do is like, for me, it's like my delts and my legs. I'll do very little for those. And then it's funny because they end up, at least initially, I don't know if it's just the fact that I'm doing less total work, they seem to grow initially. And then at a certain point, eventually, they start to actually take a step back. But it's funny, I run a cycle that's a bit more symmetrical before I start my season, and boom, it's like it comes right back. So I guess this is for anyone who's thinking about running something like this, where they're going to get off the gas on a specific body part and give more, rob Peter to pay Paul. There's, I guess, two things that can happen. I think one, you will see that like your high responding body parts are actually going to grow and might sometimes, because that's basically all they need. I don't know. Your triceps are like Jeff Albert's, I guess, right? Where it's like this is all they need for a positive adaptation. Anything more, and you might be slowing growth down. So that's very common. And then also, what does happen, and it's partially okay. Is you might see that your strong body parts might take a step back, but it's funny because as soon as you run something that's a bit more symmetrical, they'll come right back right away.
Yep.
Like it literally takes a month or so, and you're like, oh, you were actually there. You never really went away. So I would say for an intermediate, maybe 3 specialization blocks a year. For an advanced athlete, I think honestly that's how the majority of your work should look like. Yeah. There's absolutely no way that you're going to be able to do everything at once. No way. Not at that point.
Right. Word. Brad, were you going to say something?
No, I was just agreeing with Bert. And pretty much Bert puts into words exactly what it is that I do.
Okay. I was just going to say, and what's your take on how you handle it? But okay.
Yeah, it's pretty much just what he said. Like with me, of course, now because I'm a little bit more powerlifting focused, a lot of my big lifts are always there. But when you talk about my secondary work, I've got a kind of a list of 9 things that Eric prescribes for me. 4 of those are back focused. And, 1 or 2, 1 for biceps, 1 for triceps. And so you can kind of see, of course, everything else is kind of dispersed among quadriceps, calves, delts, etc. And it's like that almost all the time. I mean, really, the only time we switch this is during a deload or a taper. And just like Bert said, it's like, okay, well, it looks like, and I don't have great arms. They're barely 16 inches. But because of the way that they attach, and I've got a really high attachment, I have what looks like a pretty good bicep. And so it never really goes away. It might smooth out a little bit, as I'm going through that block of back focus. But then as soon as we do a taper or a deload and we chop the back sets in half and drop them back to 2 for, say, maybe 2 weeks at most, we'll pick up a little bit more on the biceps, increase the volume there, increase a few sets there, and then boom, the hardness starts coming back again, and those little splits start kind of sticking out in areas that I wasn't seeing them before. And then boom, we're right back to the majority of the work being done on the back and the thickness of the back and the lats. We got back to our 4 movements, essentially what is that 4 times? So that's what, 12 sets a week. And then the biceps cut back again to just the 1 exercise, basically 3 or 4 sets a week.
Yeah. And I think, too, what I find quite refreshing is, right, with my whole, it's been almost exactly a year that I've switched from physique-focused training to strictly performance-based. And that's been a fun experiment because my lower half looks better than ever. I do 0 accessory work. I do 0 arm work. And that's with an injured shoulder. I'm surprised my upper half didn't disappear while it was injured. And now that I'm coming back after 6 months away, it's slowly coming back. And then while the shoulder was having its thing, I just did a shit ton of heavy compounds on lower half. That's all I do: Olympic lifting and powerlifting things, jumping, plyo, stuff like that. But so it's a bigger variety of compound movements, but no isolation work at all. And I hurt my knee. I was out of it for 6 weeks. No, probably 2 months. And I didn't feel my lower half deflate until the last couple weeks. And literally after 2 weeks in, it was back to normal. So I found all of that super refreshing. Just kind of, it's funny how, right, the longer we're in bodybuilding, the more we realize, a lot of shit doesn't matter as much as, luckily, a lot of shit doesn't matter as much as we thought, right? We were all freaking out for nothing. Now, you both said, when we run a specialization cycle, we see something get better. To manage expectations, when we say something got better or we see improvements, how big of improvements are we talking? Berto, what you think?
I think you have to put that on a relative scale. So you have to compare what you might have gotten over the last 4 months to these next 4 months. And I think that would be you can't expect to go from, that guy who's struggling to, have arms that, look very bodybuilder-ish. You can't expect that person to just make this transformation, boom, 20-inch guns. No, your genetic limitations are always going to be your genetic limitations. But we can always improve them. I do think that. So yeah, you have to scale it down to the progress you have seen before, and which is kind of unfortunate, right? But that's the truth of it. I mean, it's bodybuilding is the ultimate human dog show almost. It's
right.
It's really what it is, right? It's there's a breed standard, and don't feel bad if you're the Chihuahua.
Well, in Brad though, isn't it 2%. Like we're saying, like I saw a big difference, but it's like 1 to 2%. It's like if you're not a neurotic bodybuilder looking at yourself every day, you wouldn't notice it.
Yeah.
Like that's so when we say like, oh, it's going to make a big difference. It's like when I say, oh, my legs have changed. It's like only because I look back 6 months on Instagram every once in a while, not because like today I noticed.
Yes.
Or anything like that.
It's like with me, as I was trying to improve my lats, it just all of a sudden one day I just was standing there in my symmetry pose and I'm like, oh my God, I can see my lats. You know, that's the kind of improvement that I saw. You know, it was not even hardly measurable except for I could see them. And even Bert with his calves, you know, it was just all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, look at Bert's calves. They look really good, you know, and that was through a lot of effort. And yeah, he's absolutely right. Is he ever going to have Jeff Albert's calves? No. But you look at his relative improvement, he's gone from basically having just, you know, I guess cankles, for lack of a better term, to actually having a calf, you know.
Chihuahua calves, Bert.
Chihuahua calves, yeah. That's me. But it's so much easier to measure these things with powerlifters because, you know, your increases in performance are a lot more objective. So, you know that maybe 8 weeks, 2 to 3% is what you were getting on your bench press. And then, you know, we can't deadlift for some reason, and boom, like you netted 5 to 6%, and then you did it again, another 5 to 6%. You're like, oh, you know, I can use this a few times a year. But yeah, with bodybuilders, it's going to be, especially once you get into that middle intermediate phase, it's going to be months and months of work, and you're going to have to compare it to the way you were previously progressing on those body parts.
Yeah. I just want to make sure people aren't like, let me run this 1 8-week cycle and my biceps will be twice as big, but then my legs will shrink, and then it's so small. I don't know.
Yeah, and even when they shrink, do they really shrink or do they just look different?
They just deflate. It's
like
different.
Yeah, it is. That's probably a good way to describe it, is they deflate a little bit. Because like when my arms start to smooth out, that's exactly what happens. They just start to smooth out a little bit. But then as soon as I start increasing that frequency, all of a sudden splits are showing up, you know, and there's it's like when you squeeze a balloon, you know, and the balloon kind of starts to bulge out between your fingers. That's kind of what my biceps start to do. They don't actually grow, but they start getting little bulges and little splits in areas that, you know, I haven't seen in a while I've, you know, dropped the volume down there.
Yeah. And that's funny too, is like we said, it's sort of our job. We make fun of all the people on Instagram or whatever, but if you aren't, you kind of do need to obsessively take a few pictures of yourself every once in a while. Make sure that you can even notice these things, because a lot of my athletes in prep, if the scale doesn't move 3 or 4 weeks, they start freaking out. It's like, okay, go pull up your picture from 12 weeks ago. Oh, okay. It's like, calm down, you know, but that's the data that you need. That's the reassurance that a lot of us need to realize that things are happening. So anyways, that's just part of other than body weight and macros and all that stuff, I think it is important that when you do recognize that you're in the dog show, you have to take pictures of the dog every once in a while to make sure it's changing appropriately.
Yeah, and sometimes with us neurotic bodybuilders, we actually got to almost do the exact opposite. Bert put up a great post way long time ago. I think it was about 10 years ago on the bodybuilding.com forums, where he just basically wore a sweatshirt for like 8 months and never looked at himself in the mirror. And then all of a sudden he took the sweatshirt off and it was like, oh, wow, look at all the changes, you know? But sometimes that neurotic bodybuilder, you're going to say, okay, let's take pictures now. And then I don't want you even looking at yourself for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
And then let's take pictures again and compare the two of them. And then let's see what we've done.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's like you need the records, but if you obsess daily, you won't see the changes because you see yourself every day.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like watching that proverbial boiling pot of water, you know? When.
Yeah. That is a damn good point. So what other possibilities for, so lagging body parts, genetically, we could not have, you know, everything on our side. We could not be eating enough. We could, and you don't even want to say like you could not be training them enough. It's just they need that much more stimulus, right? Is it always done through accessories? Who wants to go with that first?
Ooh, question. Bert, I'll let you go.
I think often, yes. I think the people who are very symmetrical, like just like they look like those, like the trophies back there and the bodybuilding trophies. I mean, when they deadlift, it looks like everything is working. You know, their calves, your quads, your hamstrings, everything's like involved. So I think, yeah, I would say that is going to be the biggest difference between someone who's finishing up their beginner phase and entering the intermediate phase, is that you're just going to need more volume. But again, you can't just add more and more of the big compounds in there. It's usually going to be some of those secondaries, and that's where you'll see, you know, more lateral raises being thrown in if that's what they need. You know, it's, I guess, like putting the clay on the statues is probably the best way to describe it. So I do think that the majority of it is going to be via secondaries. However, I think one case that really comes to mind where that was not necessarily what took that physique to the next levels is actually Lane Norton's legs. Like, he used to have these legs that you're like, dude, you're doing 40 reps on the leg press. This is back when we thought, like, you know, the more intensive something is, and by intensive, just like that means perceived as like difficult and it hurts, which sets of 40 on a leg press surely are, I think that can be considered intensive. We're like, dude, you're screwed. And then he just started, you know, throwing in some smarter programming where he was focused more so on progressive mechanical tension and, you know, just doing everything smarter across the board. And I'd say that, yeah, his legs are actually quite impressive now. So yeah, I think first you start with that. It's like, what are you doing with your compounds? And if you're just that guy that comes in and he tries to bench press 3 plates every single day, gets it once sometimes he doesn't. If that's your approach, then okay, let's look at that first. But for the majority of us, I do feel that secondaries are what's going to take that physique to that next level. And that is actually something that you will see with hybrid athletes, where they're maybe there's a section in their off season where they're focused more so on their powerlifting. You know, and again, there's only so much of you to go around. And I've seen, for example, another one, Lane Norton has some incredible arms, like just some huge arms. And I think it was 2015 Nationals. I was like, dude, like, you have powerlifter arms. Like, that was like, I never thought I'd see that. I thought he'd be the guy that just do some pull-ups and you'll be fine. But yeah, I do believe, from my experience, that secondaries are what's going to pinpoint your needs, I guess.
Okay. Same, Brad, for the most part?
You know, I think for me, a lot of times, that's the first place I always go to. You know,
right.
if we do decide that indeed this is a lagging body part, I think that's the first thing I always do. I say, okay, let's add in some isolation stuff. Let's add in some curls, side lateral raises, leg curls, leg extensions, calves, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And really, to be honest with you, it never really even occurred to me that, you know, yeah, okay, look at, you're trying like heck to progress on this 3-plate bench press, and your volume is so negligible, you know, that we can't even really quantify it in any way, shape, or form. Well, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just go right to doing flies and, you know, cable crossovers and things like that. Maybe we should actually work on that volume on that bench press. So yeah, I think in my mind, I always thought lagging body part, more accessory work, isolation stuff. But I think that's an excellent point that I never really thought of, is let's look at the foundation first. Let's look at our bench volume. Let's look at our, you know, actual pressing volume, and then maybe fix that first, and then build that, and then maybe start adding in the secondary accessory work after.
Yeah.
People tend to skip the fundamentals, I feel. And, you know, and sometimes it's the opposite. They'll have this really well thought out program where they know their tonnage, but you see like what's actually going on inside the numbers, and you're like, dude, like, you're actually not benching with your chest at all. Like, you are rolling your shoulders forward. It's horrible. We're gonna have to start from scratch.
Yeah, it's a good point too.
It's just like the fundamentals they're never in fashion, unfortunately, but it is essential. It's funny. I think about things that we can put in squares now based off this podcast. That's one.
You're like, that's a good quote square.
It's not the size. It's not the size of the fight in the dog, but the size of the bite in the fight. There we go.
Yeah, that's it. That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah, that's it.
You nailed it. Yeah.
There we go. Use that, guys.
Oh, okay. Here's. I have a square, by the way, that has Eric, or I'll put it on Instagram, but it has Eric on my back and piggyback, and it's the actual quote that says, "All Andrea does is kipping pull-ups and emails."
Yeah,
because they pulled that out of that episode. I was like, solid. Thanks, guys. Anyways.
I can think of use that dog one.
Now another thing, because Bert, you're so trendy and shit. So I get the athlete questions about you often. Even when you're not injured, you like to use BFR. Can you talk about why that is, when you would do it, and why? I already said that. Why, when, how, those things.
I guess BFR is looked at as like the ultimate secondary movement. It's like you're not really interested in getting strong.
That's
just like
how you
you're
grow.
Going after that. Yeah. I like to use BFR is I'm getting like closer to my heavier weights in my training cycle, just to kind of ease off whatever stress might be going around from the heavy lifting. So I've been using it a lot more for my hamstring curls, for my direct arm work, because I have a few big bench pressing and front squatting sessions coming up. So that's one practical use that I have found for it. It's also, however, I think a wonderful way for certain body parts, if you're lacking there, to get more volume in without necessarily, adding too much to your recovery bill, if you will. You can do that with a little bit more frequency, I feel, compared to your traditional weight training, just because there's definitely, I feel, a lot less muscle damage. So yeah, blood flow restriction is a wonderful tool if like you're lagging arms or something like that. And anecdotally, personally, and I hope people don't like just jump on this, I feel that I grow better.
They will.
When
I include it in my training. I really do. And I think a lot of it is just because I'm so spent by the time I get to my direct arm work, for example. It's not because there's something magical there. I'm so spent that I think my technique just tends to falter with traditional resistance training, a traditional 3x10 on a curl. Or mentally I'm just not there. Whereas with BFR, it's like, hey, it's going to be working whether you like to or not, so long as you just keep this elbow moving, right? So I have found it to be very practical. I don't think there's anything magical. It's very convenient. It's a good tool to it's good to be versed in it, I guess, especially if, like, say one day you actually need it because something is hurt. But yeah, it's something that I use quite frequently. And I do feel that it helps me. It gives me that extra 5%, if you will.
I think, something that I want to make sure people listening consider is that you are a very high-level trainee, and when you do compounds, it does beat you up. And a lot of times, these people that follow you or are very early stage intermediates are like, well, I must be, and it's like it's step 12 and you're on like 3, and it's just very it's not like if you did BFR it wouldn't work. It's just there's so many, like you said, fundamental things that you could do and continue progressing at. If something hurts, I understand, but a lot of times this question is brought about by people who are just trying to be about that life, about Berto's life, and it's just like highly unnecessary, and the risk of you incorrectly using it is much higher than you just like sticking to your guns and just like eating and growing, and you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
So I think it's just one thing I wanted to get out there, although I'm sure it works wonders for you in all the ways you want it to.
I know how to curl, and I know how to do tricep extensions, and I'll go out on a limb and say that, like, I can't watch like 90% of people do their secondaries.
That's true. He can't watch me do lateral raises. It's painful for him. I can feel it. He's just over there.
Compounds.
Brad, do you use BFR? And if so, in what cases?
I use it myself very sparingly.
Okay.
A lot of times with me, it's kind of like Bert. It's when, you're just so spent from training. It's late on a Saturday, and I still need to get my curls or triceps or leg extensions in. And it like you said, it's very convenient. you basically slap your tourniquet on. I can plop my butt down on the leg extension machine, and I can just sit there and knock out 4 or 5 sets of BFR with relative ease, considering that the only thing I want to do is just eat and sit down and veg in front of the TV and watch Walking Dead. That's a lot of times how I'll use it. I know I'm obsessed with it. Sorry. But yeah, I mean, most of the time for me, for prescribing for athletes, I'd say 90% of it is in, battling an injury. And then the other 10% is just like that little, 2% more volume that we could possibly get from that athlete that we're just drilling.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, Walking Dead, I stopped watching it because like Rick was creating plots. Like that dude's like, I gotta go. And you're like, it's like, no, Rick, stay home. You don't gotta go. And then he would go and create all this mess, and that's the next 3 episodes. But it was highly entertaining. The concept.
I've never seen it. I won't do it.
Yeah, don't, because it's addicting. I've never watched TV until then.
Rick's the kind of guy that would use BFR even though he doesn't have to. That's Rick.
Exactly. He would use that before everything else.
He's that guy.
He hit 185 for triples. That's his body weight, by the way. But he wants to use BFR. Yeah.
I won't use it because I'm traumatized from grad school with it.
Oh, that's right. I
won't do it. I won't do it. I was legit in the studies. So the BFR guy, if y'all want it, Jeremy Lineker, is probably the most well published in this area in America. Anyways, and when he in America, and when he was getting his PhD, I was a master's student with him. Which, when you're in grad school, you're just a guinea pig for everybody else's studies or your subjects in these studies in the labs. And I think I did 3 or 4 of their BFR studies. And I don't ever want to do it again. Ever, unless I have to. It was like fire. It was terrible. Because we weren't using it for training. It was like, let's see how far this can go kind of study. And so you're like, okay. And so like I couldn't walk for 3 days after. It was like leg extensions in this cuff till you physically fail. And then in 3 days, we'll get to use this other cuff until you physically fail. And so then, like, there goes a week of, like, not walking and just feeling the fire of hell in your quads. And so I don't want to do it. And that's it.
Good Lord. I don't blame you.
I just don't want to do it. It sounds awful. But, yeah, and other than an injured athlete, I've never prescribed it. But I also don't feel like I've needed to yet. I'm also an early coach, so I know y'all didn't use it for a long time. Anyways. Okay, BFR. Are there any other strategies that I'm missing that you guys would suggest to help someone out with eating, training, shifting volume?
I think a big one is buying into the fact that you can drop volume off your strong body parts. Everyone has at least one, I feel. And what maintenance load is just to keep muscle mass in general is like, it's so unfair how low it is compared to what you need to progress.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're in a well-fed state, like this is how I get people to buy in. It's like, okay, so if during your prep, like for example, an athlete that I've worked with for an extended period of time is like, okay, during your prep, we had during that deep dark stage, the last 4 or 5 weeks of your diet, our volume was roughly half of what we use in the off season. And you kept all your muscle, even in the body parts that aren't necessarily the most gifted. Our current situation now, we're eating enough to sustain. So just by default, it's easier to keep muscle. You have that going. And not only are you eating enough, you're eating maybe a little bit more than enough. You have some sort of surplus. And we're talking about a really strong body part. So let's exchange volume. Let's get off the gas on those arms. And let's focus on your back. And that was a Kevin Riley story this last offseason. I don't think he did any direct arm work, really, for the most part. Like 80% of his offseason.
This bastard.
And he did just fine. His arms look fantastic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's the buy-in. Is like if maintenance load is so low, even when we're in a caloric deficit, if we're eating enough and then some, like, let's drop the volume on that one body part and let's hand it over to Paul. And I think people will be pleasantly surprised as to, like, I think firstly it's like they don't trust They're like, but that's my trophy. Like my calves are like my go-to body part. Like I don't want that to go away. So obviously it's hard to trust that for like they're being promised here. It's like maybe that body part body part will be a little better. Like it's really hard to buy into that. But I think once you have a few of those under your belt, it's hard to like bodybuild any other way. I guess you can't even call it bodybuilding. It's like specific body parts building, something like that, right?
Part building.
Yeah. Part building, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times, I think bodybuilders that, or at least chronic bodybuilders that are really chronically doing leg extensions, leg curls, isolation type stuff, and they're almost afraid to do squats. And all of a sudden they've come to the realization of, oh, well, I can only get so far doing this. I do actually probably need to get stronger doing the main lifts that, get us the most progress. How do we allocate that switch, from the other way around, almost changing from a bodybuilding type of a perspective to a strength of an athlete. And so a lot of times, can you trade numbers for numbers, trade strictly quantitative volume in a bodybuilding, type of an environment to a powerlifting type of environment. And a lot of times you can't. But a lot of times, if you start, like you've experienced, Andrea, if you start, chipping away at those isolation movements and start slowly replacing that with things like squats and things like that, and ass to grass squats, as you start getting better and better at your performance of your squat, now you're starting to pick up unquantified volume. Whereas if your squat was only, say, going this far, a foot and a half in depth, with justifiable tonnage of, it's like 15,000 a week. If you're staying at that same 15,000 and now your squat is getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and each stroke is getting longer and longer and longer, you're starting to make up for all that volume that you thought you lost when switching from the bodybuilding type of a split, doing 15s and 20s, to doing 8s and 10s on squats. And so you can kind of start allocating your resources differently in that way as well.
Yeah, I think too what a lot of people miss sometimes, and that I've found quite useful and refreshing, is I forget I was a little gymnast kid. We forget there's other sports out there that do everything every day, right? And I've been so pleasantly surprised by what my body has been able to handle that would have just been outrageous in a bodybuilder split, when my, like right now, currently, I'm Olympic lifting 3 or 4 days a week, also doing some type of squat 3 or 4 days a week, and even on jerk day, which is an overhead press, that's still me jumping with all of my might in my legs. So like literally every day, I'm getting at least up to like 80% of leg something. And I'm cool.
Yeah, and when was the last time you leg pressed?
Oh shit.
Exactly. And
honestly, probably a year and a half ago.
Better.
Probably a year and a half ago. Because I still was doing like powerlifting type stuff, so I was just squatting and deadlifting. I've never been a big leg presser since my last prep, probably. A couple years, 3 years maybe.
You proved my point.
Yeah, and like Bert, what is the maximum amount? Like when you say right now you're in a back special. Did I not hear you right? What specialization cycle you're in right now? Back.
Arm.
How much is too much? I guess can we end with that when we're saying like, all right, there's all these things you can do, but how much is too much? Bert and then Brad, let me know what y'all think about that.
I think I want to be a bit conservative with this. So, like, let's just say if you are going to taper off your strong body parts, and let's just say you cut the volume in half. I would say that a good place to start is just doing that. That would probably, and then just kind of let the other things get more of the recovery resources that are floating about. That's probably a good place to start. Okay. And then once it gets to the point where you're like, okay, maybe my legs stayed, I didn't lose my legs, I'm ready to add more, and maybe you just didn't see the progress you thought you would, because if you see the progress that you were looking for all these months, you're like, oh wow, like my seal row increased by like 15 pounds like over the last 3 months. I've been looking for that. Then there you go. That's probably a routine or a split or what have you that looks unbalanced, but it's balanced to your needs, right? And then if it doesn't work and it's like, okay, I'm going to have to add more to this specific body part, I would say probably a third of the total volume that you are doing would be a good place. And if possible, something that I think is highly underrated is perhaps starting off with those body parts in the beginning of your training day. So maybe if that extra volume that you have for your side delts, maybe start your leg day with that, because that's the area that you're bringing some of the volume down on. There is something I feel to like your first movement being that body part that you want to bring up. That's where we're mentally at our freshest. That's where we're physically at our freshest. So it makes sense to kick it off with that. So yeah, I would say at first just have a system that doesn't look very symmetrical. If that doesn't work, then like let's add a third of what you're doing to that body part. And then also exercise order I feel matters. So long as you don't do something that's like fundamentally wrong, like don't go, doing your triceps before you bench press. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
So that would be, I think, a good place to shoot from the hip from.
Nice. Brad, anything to add to that, or do you do it differently?
Yeah. No, not really, except for the only thing that really I try to always account for is what I like to term compound interest.
Okay.
Because, sure, say we do throw that additional third in at the beginning of a block. And so maybe that's, it feels like enough for the first, portion of a block, say the first 3 or 4 weeks. But then as we continue that block and that compound interest continues to multiply and multiply and multiply, and now the latter portion of this block, it almost feels like too much. And what does feel like? It's a very subjective thing, maybe now we're not able to progress anymore. Maybe, some of the other things that we're trying to improve on are starting to lag. Maybe it goes as far as you've actually injured yourself, There's so many different variables that play into effect when you are trying to increase volume. And just like Berto, I think the smart thing is start conservative, start very conservative. Throw that extra third in there. Make the loads manageable enough that you can complete all your sets and never touch an RPE of like 9. Build on it, see how it works. If everything is, feeling pretty good, maybe deload, start it again, run a little bit longer block, see how that feels. Because you do have to always account for that compound interest. I mean, it's just like Jeff Alberts always talks about, pennies in the bank, pennies in the bank, pennies in the bank. That all accumulates, and what could work at the beginning, it might have felt like enough at the beginning, could be too much by the end.
Okay.
I'm glad there was no verbal typo there, Brad, with pennies in the bank. Don't say it. They'll put it in a square.
They should make a square. Brad makes posts about penises.
Okay. Yeah, for those of you guys that don't know. And he left the typo. That was the best part. It's like, I would have done the same thing, dude. Like, just, what was it? You're depositing penises.
In the bank.
Yeah, depositing. Yeah. I just left it to it. It was too good not to.
You have there. Yeah.
A couple of rooms back there in his house. He has a bank of penises. Don't you worry about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to bring this back and add a little on a serious note, we talked about like the fundamentals, getting the fundamentals in place, and I think like specialization cycles, just the word specialization, right? It's like, this is special, this is unique, right? You're a snowflake. I think getting back to fundamentals, make sure that like whatever you're doing, maybe your back sucks, and it's like, well, you don't even know how to row. Like you're doing like one of those like inverted chest rows that you see people on the
curl row.
The curl
curls,
row.
Yeah, the reverse curl row.
Make sure you know what you're doing within those movements. I think that's super important. I think that's initially when my back went from ribs to like having some lats on there. That was probably the first thing, was just like I learned how to row correctly.
Yeah, word.
I like that. like that chest row, and I'm guilty of this too, you know, where you're doing the row, but the handle never moves. You know, it's kind of like the body is moving, but the handle is not moving at all, you know?
Oh, man.
Oh, guys love doing that with that T-bar row that they set up in the corner.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
there's crappy range of motion anyways. Like, that 45 hits you in the chest. Your humerus is moving 2 inches, like, best case. And then you're doing that thing where you're moving, the weight's not really moving.
Yeah, exactly. And if it is moving, it's moving this far in a little pulsating fashion. So 2 inches.
I know. For people who didn't see it on YouTube, I'm sad about it. But that was good, Brad.
You can picture it, though. The body's moving and the bar is not.
I think that was good, y'all.
Yeah.
Thanks for thanks for chatting with me. See you guys next time. See you guys next time. We'll do a Steve.
Or Steve. How's the Steve go?
Like that. He does this at the end of his video. Brad, you're not going to give us one?
Oh, sorry.
Okay, we can hang up. See y'all next time.